It started in total silence. The leader was dead, executed by the most brutal method the Roman Empire had ever invented: crucifixion. This wasn't just a method of execution, it was a public billboard meant to say, "Do not mess with Rome." His followers, a ragtag group of fishermen, tax collectors, and rural radicals, were currently hiding behind locked doors in the back streets of Jerusalem. They were terrified. They knew how this game was played. When a rebel leader is taken out, his lieutenants are next on the list. By all historical logic, the movement known as the Way should have ended right there, in the dark, roughly around the year 30 AD. It should have been a footnote in a Roman history book. 12 uneducated men against an empire of 60 million people? The odds weren't just bad, they were impossible. But they didn't vanish. Instead, something bizarre happened. Within a few weeks, these terrified men were standing in the public squares shouting that their leader was alive. Within a few decades, they had infiltrated the major trade routes of the world. And within 100 years, they had set the foundation for an organization that would outlast the Caesars, the legions, and the empire itself. But the cost of this expansion was astronomical. It's a story filled with political backstabbing, mysterious disappearances, international espionage, and gruesome executions. This isn't just a Sunday school story. It is the violent, chaotic history of the first century. You have to understand the atmosphere in Jerusalem in the weeks following the crucifixion. It was a powder keg. Jerusalem wasn't a peaceful, holy city. It was an occupied war zone. The Roman garrison was stationed in the Antonia fortress, literally overlooking the temple courts, watching for any sign of rebellion. The authorities thought they had crushed the problem by killing Jesus. But then came the festival of Pentecost. Reports claim that the disciples, who had been hiding in fear, suddenly flooded the streets with a manic, unstoppable energy. They weren't just preaching, they were causing a scene so loud and chaotic that locals accused them of being drunk at 9 in the morning. They began speaking in languages they hadn't learned, a phenomenon that shocked the international crowds gathered for the festival. This wasn't a quiet prayer meeting, it was an explosion. In a single day, the movement reportedly swelled from a few dozen to over 3,000 people. This created an immediate logistical nightmare for the high priest and the Sanhedrin. You had thousands of people suddenly staying in Jerusalem, refusing to leave. They started doing something that looked very suspicious to the authorities. They created a radical communal society. They were selling property, pooling their money, and eating together daily. To the Romans, this looked like the start of a socialist uprising. To the Jewish elite, it looked like heresy. The temple guards began arresting the apostles, throwing them in prison and beating them. But every time they let them go, the apostles went right back to the same spot to preach again. The authorities realized they hadn't killed the movement, they had just poured gasoline on it. The tension finally snapped with a man named Stephen. As the group grew, they needed administrators, and Stephen was one of the best. But he wasn't just a food distributor, he was a debater. He went head-to-head with the members of the synagogue of the freedmen, and he didn't hold back. Things got heated, literally. The debate turned into a trial, and the trial turned into a mob execution. They dragged Stephen out of the city walls to a pit. This was the moment the gloves came off. It was the first time the establishment realized they could kill these people without legal repercussions. Witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young, angry man who was supervising the execution. This is where the villain enters the story. His name was Saul of Tarsus. If you're picturing a gentle religious scholar, think again. Saul was a hunter. He was authorized by the high priest to root out this new cult by any means necessary. He wasn't just debating them, he was kicking down doors. He was dragging men and women out of their homes and throwing them in prison. He was voting for their executions. The church in Jerusalem panicked. They fled. They ran to the countryside, to Samaria, to the coast. But here is the irony of persecution. By forcing them to run, Saul actually helped them. Instead of bottling the message up in Jerusalem, the refugees took it with them. The virus spread because the host was attacked. Saul wasn't satisfied with clearing out Jerusalem. He wanted to cut off the head of the snake. He heard that the movement had spread north to Damascus, a major trading city in Syria. He got his warrants and hit the road, intent on bringing the refugees back in chains. But he never made it to Damascus, at least not as a hunter. This is the plot twist that nobody saw coming. On the road, something happened. Saul claimed he was surrounded by a light so bright it blinded him, and he heard the voice of the very man he was trying to erase. He was led into the city by the hand, blind and broken. He didn't eat or drink for 3 days. When he finally regained his sight, the hunter defected. He changed his name to Paul. Imagine the shock in Jerusalem. The news started trickling back. The man who was killing us is now preaching for us. It was a PR disaster for the religious authorities. Their top enforcer had switched sides. But Paul's conversion brought a new problem, a massive internal crisis that almost destroyed the church before it really began. Paul believed that this message wasn't just for Jews. It was for everyone, Greeks, Romans, barbarians. He began letting Gentiles join the movement without forcing them to follow Jewish laws like circumcision or dietary restrictions. This caused a massive scandal. The original disciples in Jerusalem, led by Peter and James, the brother of Jesus, were traditional. They heard rumors that Paul was telling people to ignore the law of Moses. There was real friction here. The Bible hints at a heated shouting match between Peter and Paul in the city of Antioch. To stop the movement from splitting in two, they held the Council of Jerusalem around 50 AD. It was the first major boardroom showdown of the church. The stakes were incredibly high. If they forced Gentiles to become Jewish, Christianity would remain a small sect. If they didn't, they risked losing their heritage. In the end, they sided with Paul. The doors were thrown open to the world. While Paul was taking over the narrative with his letters and his famous journeys across the Mediterranean, a big mystery remained. What happened to the other 12? The Bible stops tracking most of them after the first few chapters of Acts, but ancient traditions, local legends, and apocryphal texts fill in the blanks with some wild stories. These men didn't just retire, they scattered to the winds. Take Thomas, for instance. He's famously known as Doubting Thomas, but history suggests he was actually the most ambitious traveler of them all. Traditions claim he traveled further east than any Roman soldier, heading all the way to India. To this day, in the Kerala region of India, there is a community known as the Mar Thoma Christians, who claim their lineage goes back to his arrival in 52 AD. He was reportedly speared to death by angry locals who felt he was disrupting the caste system. Then there's Andrew. Accounts say he went north into the brutal lands of Scythia, modern-day Ukraine and Russia. These were areas known for savage tribes and cannibalism. He walked straight into the dark. Bartholomew allegedly went to Armenia. His death is the stuff of nightmares. Tradition says he was flayed alive, skinned, before being beheaded. This wasn't a peaceful spread of religion. It was a high-stakes adventure where the mortality rate was 100%. They were walking off the edge of the known map into hostile cultures with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Fast forward to the 60s AD. The movement had reached the heart of the beast, Rome itself. There was a thriving underground church in the capital,
but the political climate was shifting dangerously. The Emperor Nero was on the throne, and by all accounts, the man was losing his mind. He was paranoid, cruel, and obsessed with his own artistic genius. Then, in the summer of 64 AD, a catastrophe struck. A fire broke out in the shops near the Circus Maximus. Fanned by summer winds, it raged for 6 days, destroying 70% of the city. The people were furious. They had lost everything. Rumors started
flying that Nero himself had arranged the fire to clear space for his new Golden House palace. People claimed they saw his men starting fires, and others said Nero was on his balcony singing about the destruction of Troy while Rome burned. Nero needed a scapegoat, fast. He couldn't blame the gods, so he pointed the finger at the Christians. They were already unpopular because they refused to worship the emperor and held secret meetings. What followed was a horror show that shocked even the hardened Romans. The historian Tacitus wrote about it. Nero didn't just execute them, he made it a spectator sport. He held garden parties at night and used Christians as lighting, dipping them in tar and setting them on fire to illuminate the festivities. He sewed others into the skins of wild animals and let hunting dogs tear them apart in the arena. It was likely during this purge that the two giants of the faith, Peter and Paul, were caught. Paul, as a Roman citizen, had rights. He couldn't be tortured or crucified. He was taken outside the city walls on the Ostian Road and beheaded, a quick, honorable death. Peter's end was different. The famous legend of Quo Vadis says Peter was actually fleeing Rome to escape the persecution. As he was walking out of the city, he had a vision of Jesus walking into the city. Peter asked, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "I am going to Rome to be crucified again." Peter, ashamed of his cowardice, turned around, walked back to the soldiers, and accepted his fate. Tradition says he demanded to be crucified upside down, feeling unworthy to die in the same position as his master. If the death of the leaders wasn't enough, the world of the early church was about to physically collapse. Back in Judea, tensions between the Jews and the Romans had hit a breaking point. In 66 AD, a full-scale revolt broke out. The Jews kicked the Romans out of Jerusalem. But Rome, as always, struck back. The future Emperor Titus marched on Jerusalem with 4 legions, 60,000 hardened soldiers. They besieged the city. It was a nightmare. Inside the walls, starvation was so bad that people were resorting to cannibalism. Jewish factions were fighting each other in the streets while the Romans battered the walls. The Christians in Jerusalem, remembering a warning Jesus had given them decades earlier about armies surrounding the city, reportedly fled just before the siege tightened, escaping to a town called Pella across the Jordan River. In 70 AD, the Romans breached the walls. The slaughter was unimaginable. But the crowning blow was the destruction of the temple. This building was the center of the universe for the Jewish faith. The Roman soldiers set the gates on fire. The gold melted into the cracks of the stones, so the soldiers pried the stones apart to get it, literally leaving not one stone upon another. For the young church, this was a moment of identity crisis. With Jerusalem destroyed and the temple gone, the umbilical cord was cut. They could no longer look to Jerusalem as home. They were now a global, homeless entity. It forced the church to become independent, relying on the letters of Paul and the Gospels rather than a physical location. By the 90s AD, the first century was closing. The silence was deafening. The eyewitness generation was almost entirely gone. But there was one man left, John. He was the youngest disciple, now an old man. Tradition says he was the only apostle to escape a violent death, though legend says the Romans tried to boil him in oil and he somehow survived. He was eventually exiled to the prison island of Patmos, a rocky rock in the Aegean Sea. It was there, in a damp cave, that he wrote the final piece of the puzzle, the Book of Revelation. To the modern reader, Revelation looks like a fever dream of dragons, multi-headed beasts, and cosmic war. But historians view it as resistance literature. It was written in code. The Christians were under pressure from a new emperor, Domitian, who was demanding to be called Lord and God. John was writing to the battered churches in Asia Minor. The beast wasn't just a monster. It was likely a code for the Roman Empire. The number 666. Many scholars believe it's a numerical code for Nero Caesar. John was telling the church, the empire looks invincible. It looks like it has total power, but it will fall, and you will win. As John died around 100 AD, the church faced a new problem. There were no more apostles, no more eyewitnesses. Who was in charge? If the movement was going to survive the next century, it needed structure. This is the era of the Apostolic Fathers, men like Clement of Rome, Polycarp of Smyrna, and Ignatius of Antioch. These were the students of the apostles. Ignatius is a particularly intense figure to end on. He was the bishop of Antioch, arrested around 110 AD and marched to Rome. During his journey, he wrote 7 letters that give us a window into this new era. He was obsessed with unity and authority. He told the churches to follow their bishops as they would follow Jesus, solidifying the hierarchy that would define the church for the next millennium. But his attitude toward death shows us why Rome couldn't win. Ignatius begged the churches not to use their political connections to save him. He wanted to die. He wrote, "I am God's wheat, and I must be ground by the teeth of wild animals to become a pure loaf." He viewed his execution in the Colosseum not as a defeat, but as his greatest victory. By 130 AD, exactly 100 years after the crucifixion, the landscape had completely changed. What started as a chaotic, frightened panic in a Jerusalem upper room had hardened into a structured, resilient global network. They had survived internal civil wars, the madness of Nero, the destruction of their holy city, and the execution of their entire founding leadership. They had no army. They had no political power. They were illegal. And yet they were growing faster than the population rate. It remains one of history's great ironies. The Roman Empire spent centuries trying to crush this movement with fire, sword, and arena. But in the end, the empire crumbled and fell, leaving behind ruins for tourists to take pictures of. The church that started in the shadows of that empire, it's still here. So I have to ask, if you lived in the 1st century and you saw your leaders fed to lions, your property confiscated, and your city burned, would you have had the courage to join? Or would you have stayed in the shadows? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to know what happened after the fall of Rome, make sure you're subscribed.